doing our first podcast. And Leila Nuland and Kristi Wilson will be talking about Kristi's book, On Fire, Under Fire, or Fired, Superintendents During the Pandemic. And I think that so many of the challenges we have now and the solutions to the ones we found in the pandemic can be applied to today. So welcome Leila and Kristi.
I am Dr. Leila Nuland. I am excited to record an episode of the K12 Change Equation while here at Power Trip. For our regular listeners of the K12 Change Equation, I am here recording from Power Trip 2025. This is the 6th year of this event, and Power Trip was started because the organizers did both research and, based on their practical experience attending conferences and talking to district leaders, identified the unique challenges that women face as they rise to district leadership, balancing professional demands with personal responsibilities. So I just want to thank our organizers for Power Trip. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for allowing us to record this episode. And I want to give a little bit of background on the podcast and its origin, introduce our interviewee, and assure our audience today that you will have the opportunity to ask Kristi a few questions toward the end of the show. My journey into leadership started in the classroom as well as a 9th grade social studies teacher, and through that time I had the privilege of launching a 9th grade academy back in the late aughts. And through that, what stood out to me was we were not prepared to scale the academy, even though we started seeing early results. If you listen to episode 3 of the podcast, you're going to hear us talk about 9th grade academies. But really, from the start of my entry into public education, one of the things that we've really struggled with is to drive lasting change, systemic change. And a piece of that is the context in which you all are working is constantly changing. And so this dovetails so well with the topic today. Kristi, thank you so much for agreeing to do this show with me here. And so with that background, what we hope to get out of today, as Marilyn already alluded to, is what have we learned in our time in leadership? At dinner last night, we were talking about how we know the best practices. We really do know what we need to do to serve kids and to support our classroom teachers. How do we lead and set up our systems to sustain those practices, right? I see heads nodding in the audience. And so as we dive into this show, we are going to be talking about On Fire, Under Fire, or Fired, Superintendents in the Pandemic by Dr. Susan Enfeld and Dr. Kristi Wilson. If our audience can raise their hands with their books and see that we need to give ClassLink a big round of applause for sponsoring the book.
Thank you so much,
ClassLink. Today on the K12 Change Equation, we're joined by a leader whose voice and vision have helped shape the national dialogue around the evolving role of school superintendents. Dr. Kristi Wilson is the co-author of the provocative and timely book, On Fire, Under Fire, or Fired, Reimagining the Superintendent's Role, which explores the intense pressures and powerful opportunities facing district leaders today. In today's conversation, we'll explore what it really means to lead boldly in a time of heightened scrutiny, why the role of superintendent is more complex than ever, and how Kristi believes the job must evolve to meet the moment. Kristi, welcome to the K12 Change Equation. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much, Leila.
So, as we kick things off, I'm curious, what inspired you and Susan to take on writing this book at this moment in time?
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks for inviting me, Marilyn, and ClassLink for sponsoring the book. Susan sends her regrets. She really wishes she could be here too. So I know I'll be echoing her voice throughout the podcast. When Susan and I sat down, and she and I have been friends and colleagues for a very long time, and we were thinking about how could we, first and foremost, honor the voices of all the superintendents and leaders who led through the pandemic, who Susan and I both were superintendents during the pandemic. We were really trying to, I guess, honor voices, but really, truly provide a historical context of what superintendents went through during that time. And if you recall, there were a lot of maybe one-off articles, journals, blogs, things like of that nature that sort of, I guess, documented what people were going through, but there wasn't a real complete story or complete account of what people went through. That was one, I guess, reason we wanted to write the book, provide that historical context. But we also, and I think this is equally as important, wanted to make sure that the greater community, stakeholders, parents, people who might not really have, a vested interest in public education, but have an opinion about public education, understand the role that superintendents play in during COVID, keeping communities safe, and just as important now, what superintendents do. So those were a couple of main reasons why we wrote this book.
And it's something that we immediately connected around when I first spoke to you about taking this on together, because the origin story for the show that we launched back in January is, having been in the classroom, working alongside school districts for just over a decade now and partnering with superintendents, it's astounding how public opinion shapes your day-to-day, right? And yet, and I say this as a mom too, so I'm a mom in a school community that most of my peers, parent peers, don't understand the power of their vote when they vote in school board members, for example. And so how can we, the mission of this project and at the heart of this is we want the audience of the show today to walk away with a better understanding of the role that you all are in, empathy, and to make sure that they're educating themselves. And so before we get to the next topic, I want to read a passage that just made me teary-eyed. Your job is to lead, not to feel at that point. I got a call from a principal, and he said, "Dave, one of your security guards just died and is outside in the student parking lot. What should I do?" So I walked him through exactly the steps we were going to take, and he called me back the next day and asked, "How are you so calm through all of that?" And I said, "That's my job. I knew her. I loved her. I respected her. I will grieve later. My job was to help you lead through the situation in that moment." So letting that sit for a moment. As you think back to the pandemic, what was a turning point for you and a pivotal moment that really shaped your thinking about leadership today?
Well, first of all, that quote is from Dave Schuler, Executive Director of AASA. And before I answer that question, I do want to provide a little context in that we interviewed 40 superintendents for this book. And we only had 3 months to write the book. And so Susan and I wanted to make sure that we provided as broad of a perspective as we possibly could, that we within that short period, so that we could, make sure that the insights and takeaways were there. But Dave that's in chapter 2, I think, where we were talking about the power of networking. And I think what he was getting at, and I'll answer what was pivotal for me during that time, was that yes, you have to sometimes lead from this operational standpoint of you can't always be, emotionally invested, but and Dave and I are really good friends, and I think he would remember when I interviewed him and asked him that question, that sometimes you just have to sort of go, it's like you go into this state of helping people just get on with their day and just be operational. But I think it was yesterday, someone said, lead with empathy and be vulnerable. And that's in chapter 1. How important it is when you're navigating the unknown that you lead into your values. And as women leaders, sometimes that's, I think, one of our biggest strengths. What was pivotal for me is the power of my team. And I was sitting with, is it Brasilia? We were talking about, as a young, not young in age, but young in experience superintendent, I didn't know how to empower my team. And during COVID, I learned very quickly that we were forced to use our team members. We were forced to lean in on each other. We were forced to network and learn from one another. So I think the pivotal moment there and what we learned from that moment and carrying on post-COVID is that you have to empower each other and learn from one another and lean in and find strength in your vulnerability.
So can we dig into that a little more? Can we talk further about how did you take the time to understand the strengths you were going to leverage when at that moment in time, I think so many of us were reacting to what was right in front of us, whether it was how are we going to get food to our students and how are we going to get the devices they need. So was it something that you had already had in place? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so Jess talked about yesterday this idea, and we're doing it now, the power of, first of all, recognizing people's strengths. So in our district, we had, like many of you do, you have your cabinet meetings, your leadership meetings. And this in chapter 4 is all about self-care, making sure that you have systems in place. So pre-COVID, just as an example, we were leading with empathy. We were trying to make sure we had practice of gratitude. During COVID, we made sure that practice was elevated, whether it was during our cabinet meetings or all the way down into the classroom. What I wanted to emphasize during COVID was the power of gratitude, and what was reminded yesterday was just as example of making sure that you write in your gratitude, you share with your teammates, what do I appreciate about you? Because during COVID, we were so wrapped up in, do you guys remember, what were the contact tracing? How do you make these decisions? I know, so many operational things that we kind of forgot the practice of gratitude. And I'm just giving you that example. Then post-COVID, we tended to get away from the practice of gratitude. So that exercise, just like Jess's example yesterday, is so important. It's not one of those one and done things. You have to build that into your system of practice and keep at it. And I think it keeps your staff members, your teammates, your colleagues, first of all, it helps them remain committed and feel valued. And it's an example of self-care. But it's easy to get away from it when you sort of feel like you're stressed and you're not sure how to navigate the unknown, which is all about chapter 1.
So to that point, I love that you highlight that when we are burnt out, it's really hard for us to lead with empathy and foster that culture. And I think about burnout in the title of the book, On Fire, Under Fire, or Fired. And what I loved was yesterday, as Aaliyah was talking to all of us, she said something that I will carry with me for years to come. You can't set yourself on fire to warm others. So as we come back to the title of the book, what do you think the title represents about the superintendent experience?
Well, I want to tell you how we came up with the title, because I'm sure some of you are wondering, how did you and Susan come up with that title?
I love it.
And Susan resides in Washington. I split my time between Phoenix and Arizona. And again, I remember I told you we had this 3-month timeline. And both Susan and I, those of you who know us, are type A. We're very organized. We knew we could get it done, so we had an aggressive writing schedule. We did not have a ghostwriter. We did not have an editor who helped us with this. So Susan is a journalism major. She's a writer. I'm an okay writer, but she is a very good writer. So anyhow, I would just give you a little context there. But we decided we would meet in San Diego one weekend, and we would, just hole up and get as much done as we possibly could. I'm biting over to Deb because she's an author and a writer, and she understands what I'm talking about. So we had it this one Saturday afternoon. We were exhausted, and we both like Mexican food and margaritas. So we decided we're going to go wander over here and just have a nice afternoon. And so we're sitting over there and having hors d'oeuvres, and we thought, we need a catchy title. We had all of these sort of kind of mundane titles like leadership in the pandemic, just boring stuff. And I told her, I said, Susan, we need something catchy. We need something that's going to get people's attention, and we need something that, people, they're going to want to know what the book's about. And so we're having really, really hot salsa. And I'm like, God, this stuff is on fire. My mouth is on fire. And from there, you can imagine that we just said, it was all about maybe getting fired, or we were under fire, or we were on fire. So from there, on a cocktail napkin, mind you, we kind of scribbled out something about, this title. And if you think about it, what Susan would tell you if she was here too, is that we were on fire a lot of the time during that first phase of COVID. We were on fire because of the decisions we had to make right then and there. And then some of us were under fire because of the decisions we had to make right then and there. And then some of us either got fired or we fired ourselves. We said, we've had enough and we're going to leave the profession. So that's how we came up with the title, and that's what the title represents.
So as I'm sitting here listening to you, I'm thinking, we never come into our leadership journey with all the answers, right? We learn and we grow. And through that, I'm wondering if you could reflect on a moment in your career where you had the realization that I only just had yesterday, thank you, Aaliyah, but this idea of I cannot set myself on fire to warm others. So I imagine this predates the pandemic with how you were able to lead, but do you mind sharing a little bit about that moment for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that along the way, you kind of have these moments of clarity, I guess you would call them, where you go, oh, wow, I should have done that differently, or had I had a moment to reflect on that. But my, I guess, aha along the way is that, and I kind of go back to what I think it's Laura who was saying, you don't have to do it all yourself. And I was was superintendent at 39, and I was talking to Brasilia about this. I think I've always been the kind of leader who was looking for the next step, going the extra mile, what's on the horizon. And if I could kind of go back and redo things, I would probably just be a little more patient and not, just be happy with where I'm at, because you only have a runway. Once you become a superintendent, you can only be a superintendent for so long. Most of us. So, and the whole thing about empowering your team, it's really different now as a superintendent, as all of you know. Leading during the pandemic and leading now, vastly different. I'm sure we're going to get into the politics a bit. Oh, yeah. And so I think you just have to, again, chapter 1 is all about navigating the unknown. And there's 3 lessons there about being vulnerable, being nimble, and being, leading from your values. And there's a lot of lessons there. And I just think you have to figure out what that really means to you.
So as you were writing this and conducting the interviews and thinking about what the opportunities were coming out of the pandemic era, though some days it feels like we're still in it. What were some of the most surprising opportunities that you discovered?
Well, I don't know if it was an opportunity, but one of the things that was surprising to both Susan and I, so remember, there were 40 superintendents, East Coast, West Coast, North, South, big districts, small districts, rural districts. I was telling the dinner table last night. And here's kind of an aha for both Susan and I that came up. So if you think back, so it was 5 years ago, if you think back, we had a set of questions that we asked everybody. And we tried to just make sure we had a very diverse group. And we had pretty much standard questions, how did you lead through the COVID? Were you open? When did you close? All of those operational things. But one of the things that surprised us, I guess, was, you remember COVID hit, and prior to that, there was a lot of controversy in a lot of school districts around George Floyd's murder. And that came up in almost all of the conversations in some way, shape, or form. So it resurfaced, and it resurfaced a lot of trauma for a lot of superintendents that hadn't really had a chance to be talked about. So I think the opportunity that presented, at least for Susan and I, was for a place for that to sort of just surface and talk about. And I just don't think we weren't sure that how that was going to come about, because the book was about COVID per se. So that was sort of an aha and an opportunity, and it was a theme across all of the districts.
So I'm thinking about how this surfaces, and one of the things that we saw coming out of the pandemic was we need to focus on how we're going to serve our kids, right? Learning loss, issues of equity. Let's fast forward to this moment in time. You write a lot about communication and transparency and the role of superintendent as chief communicator. What advice do you have, and what are your reflections on this particular moment in time when, we talked about this in the context of social emotional learning yesterday. There are these terms and issues that have been so politicized. What are you thinking about right now for our superintendents in this room, and what are some of the key takeaways in the book that you think apply in this particular area?
Well, there's a couple things that come to mind. So I wish Martha was here. Martha from Salazar Zamara from Tomball was here yesterday. She was going to be part of our podcast, but Leila will tell you about that in a minute. But she was featured in the book, and she talked a lot about how her communication style changed during and after COVID. And one of the examples that she shared was, so prior to COVID, which I was like this, and maybe many of you were too, we were pretty good at communicating, but it was a very traditional model of communicating with a sprinkling in of Instagram and social media and all of that. But she's so cute. She has an example of how, she would send out her newsletter and her name with her 3-degree letters after, and the community kind of knew the superintendent, Dr. So-and-so, PhD, blah, 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 blah. And then during COVID, we not only were the target of a lot of criticism, but in some cases, we became the face of the communication. So, for example, like Martha talked about, we were at the grocery store in some of the smaller communities. People knew us because we were the ones on the video all kinds. So the opportunity was kind of a double-edged sword. People got to know you as a superintendent differently. So fast forward, and the lesson learned is that can be a good thing. It can be an ally. It can be a way to get to know and get to involve your stakeholders in a different way. But you have to utilize strategies and employ others to help you to harness that in a different way if you're not used to it. But the other thing I would just tell you is that parents and stakeholders expect it. If you're in Arizona, and Barb from Marshall knows this, it's school choice capital. They expect school and school systems to look and feel differently. Gone are the days that you can just kind of send out an email and just expect that to be the way you're going to communicate. So I think the lesson learned there is just that you have to be transparent, but you have to be transparent responsibly with the information that you share. And we can help you with that. There's a lot of people who have experience with that can help you.
Well, and we talked about it here yesterday, right? The power of the narrative and telling your story, and that's one of my takeaways coming out of this conference is thinking about how do we leverage our story as leaders to shape the conversation and help mitigate whether it's the pushback or misperception. I mean, you talk about school's choice along my journey in working with superintendents. This goes back maybe 8 years ago, but I remember getting a call that we needed to talk about the brand. And that wasn't something we were really actively talking about, right? But this superintendent was saying that she and her team were getting these calls complaining about these schools that weren't even under the direction of the school system. They were charter schools, right? And so just this basic understanding in our communities of who are we? What do we do? What do we not do? What are we responsible for? And it stood out to me in the book, all that came onto, we've been talking a lot about our plate here over the past few days, but all that's on our plate, but also making sure the community understands what's not on our plate.
Yeah, I think that was one of the main, going back to kind of the beginning, the main purposes of the book was to help others know what is the role of the superintendent and how is it changing. It used to be that, if you remember, when you became a superintendent, there was this thing that used to be, well, you're either really good at teaching and learning and you're horrible at the finances, so hire a really good CFO, or it was how it was. Or you're okay at CFO business operations and you're not very good at the teaching and learning side, so make sure you hire a really good teaching and learning leader. Now, there's a framework out of Harvard, Jennifer Chatham's work, where she's kind of leaning into this, superintendents need to be political leaders. And I think you can be both and you need to be all of those things. But I also think it's really, really important that we're clear with our communities and our parents and those that are really invested in public schools that superintendents are not primarily political leaders. We are educators. We're teachers at heart. And that governing board members should be apolitical. They should not be in politics. We're there to serve our children. So I think that's why the call to action, which Leila will talk about, is to help communities understand what it is that superintendents do and do not do.
Well, I have a funny anecdote I have to share as I'm sitting here listening to you. I was at a conference up in New York a few months ago, and a superintendent was sharing how he lives in a beach community and got a call one day about an injured seal that was on the beach, and the community was adamant that he had to get involved and handle this, right? And we were at a happy hour, we're laughing, but right, I think some of you know what it is to get a call with the expectation that you are community leader here. What are you going to do about it? And I'm thinking about one of the presentations right before us, saying no, right? That's not on my plate, that's not under my purview. And I think that's difficult.
Well, especially difficult if your board doesn't support you. So that's why we've got to have a community that understands and can back you when you do say no. And that takes, understanding the community so that they vote members in the governing board seats. So when there's major pushback, you have allied support.
So I know we need to focus on the book, but can I press on that a bit? Because I think newer superintendents really struggle with that, right? Defining those lanes and holding everybody accountable for what is governance versus what is my job as leader. So across your time in seat, how did you build those relationships, and what are some lessons you could share with our audience?
Yeah. Well, it was probably easier for me back then, even though it wasn't that long ago. But I think it starts with just honest, I think it was Lisa, who I don't know if she's still here, honesty, being really clear about your values with your board, one-on-one, and then of course as a group in open session. And you start with your clear protocols and communication protocols, and I'm sure all of you know all of that. But just some really clear tricks. We always had a student on our board, and I used to say to my board individually and then also collectively that you're a role model. You are a role model for the student. And so then individually, when something would happen that was not necessarily in the best interest of the district, or Robert's Rules of Order was not followed or something, I could privately say, remember, as a teacher or a role model to the student, this is an example of where your behavior, you're the student, so that's something. And we didn't always have students on our board, so that was a change that we made, and sometimes that helped. But I think communication protocols are really, really important, and you have to work with your board individually. I think younger novice superintendent, not younger in age, but inexperienced superintendents forget the power of relationships. You've got to get to know your board members. I know it's not fun, but you have to meet with them regularly, one-on-one, morning, noon, lunch, not inappropriately, but you have to build the relationship. You got to ask them about their families, get to know them as people, because you're getting to know them and then they're getting to know you, and it just helps so much. It just helps you build that trusting relationship.
So, thank you, and more lessons that are coming now. I really want to hear from you about how you have gotten yourself to a place where you've built resilience as a leader, and what advice you can offer the group, both on your own experience, but what you uncovered in the book, because we've also been talking about how when we're under fire or on fire, we become really brittle, right? And we have to be like water so we don't catch on fire. So I'm connecting to all the presentations. How have you learned to be like water, and how do you make sure you show up the way that you need to? And what are some lessons from the leaders you interviewed in that particular area?
I think having mentors is really important. You don't have to have a whole bunch, but you got to have like one or two that you can count on, that you can call anytime, that are going to be there for you. I always had, one or two that are still kind of I would just say my cheerleaders or my coaches or my whatever you want to call that. Because if you Google my name, you're going to see I went through a pretty horrible time around a contract issue that wasn't exactly factual, but it was a really horrible time. And it's still out there in the news, and I can't get rid of it, and it's not true. But it was not fun. And so I needed a couple mentors that I could talk to about how do I deal with this. When you have media and news or the teachers union after you, what do you do? So that's one thing. And then how you build your resilience is for me, I just figured out a plan and stuck to it. And time helps. You just kind of and be good to yourself. There's all the stuff that we're doing here is so remarkable. I didn't have this before, so I would say any opportunities that you have to be a part of this kind of networking or this type of group setting, invest in yourself. Do this. Don't look at this like, oh, it's one more thing. This is powerful, powerful stuff. I guess the best advice I would give my younger self is stop. I told Brasilia this, stop and smell the roses. Don't be in a hurry to go for the next thing. Enjoy your everyday, because tomorrow's not promised.
Yeah. It's so hard because I think probably everybody in this room would identify as high achievers, right? And so it's hard not to think about the next thing, and it's hard not to focus on the things that we got wrong versus really creating that space for what did I get right today? What did I get right this week? And that's something that I'm walking away from this experience, is focusing on the what did we do well?
Well, and that, I will say in the book, what we tried to do, so how it's outlined, and it's a pretty easy read really, is we really tried to do insights and takeaways, and then an exemplar chapter, an exemplar leadership for each chapter, so that you read it, and then there's an example of how did this district, whichever district is identified, navigate the unknown? How did this district exemplify providing self-care for staff and their community? Or how did this district, in Martha's case, provide opportunities for communication? So that's how it, and so, one of the other reasons we wrote it, not only to tell the story and document, but inspire people. That yes, we got through COVID, but when the next pandemic happens or the next catastrophic event happens, how do we take the lessons learned so that we don't repeat them?
Well, not to be hyperbolic, but it feels like we're in the middle of a catastrophic event. As our audience takes the book back to their rooms and home, and I hope you read it on the plane, and maybe, Marilyn, we can have a book club discussion about it in a month or two. What do you hope they get out of it as leaders? Because then I want to talk about what we hope others get out of it, right?
Yeah, each time I do a podcast or I talk to a group, people ask that, and I always come back to, I hope you feel inspired. I hope you don't leave the profession. I hope you don't walk away going, I don't want to be a superintendent. I'd never want that job. I absolutely loved being a superintendent. I told someone the other day, I almost went back into it just a month ago and said no because of some personal family issues, but I almost did. So that should tell you something. And we, as much as we, again, wanted to document it, what happened and tell the story, again, I loved that job. It is the greatest job. It's like I was an elementary principal for a very short period of time, and also middle school principal. Elementary principal is a great job. High school principal, not so much. But it is a great job. You get to influence, I think it was, someone said, the reason they went on from teaching was because they wanted to impact more people. I think it was Jess. As a superintendent, you get to, if you're fortunate enough, you get to build schools, you get to leave a legacy, you get to touch thousands of people's lives in the decisions that you make. So we want to make sure people feel inspired to do this work. And so hopefully you'll read it and you'll walk away going, yeah, we can get through that. We can make changes. We can shape policy, and you'll feel motivated to do the work.
So we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you have questions, start preparing to share those. I just want to share, as I read it, one of the things you said, you didn't take the job about a month ago because of personal issues. It's very easy for our communities to dehumanize us as leaders, right? And forget that you're a mom, you're a wife, you're a daughter, you're a sister. You play these other roles. And what I love about the book is it humanizes the role, not just revealing the complexity in a digestible format. So I will say this isn't just for those of us in the field. I really think everybody should pick this up. Anybody who is a voter should be reading this book right now. And so I do want to thank you for writing this, because I think this has been needed, and I too hope it's an inspiration. So thank you. And thanks to Susan, who can't be with us, for taking this project on and coming up with such a fantastic, clever title.
Of course. Yeah, Susan talks a lot about humanizing the role of the superintendent.
So audience, Does anybody have any questions for Kristi while we have her? I know you haven't had an opportunity to read the book, but the themes that we've touched upon in this episode.
Hi, I'm Melissa Moore. I'm former superintendent of El Segundo Unified in California. I survived the pandemic as superintendent as well, so thank you for writing this book. With the various superintendents that you interviewed, did you see any significant differences between what the male superintendents had to say on a particular topic or the women leaders? Having been on Zoom calls with my colleagues and being the only woman in the room via Zoom, I know how I felt sometimes as far as being vulnerable, and I'd just be curious if you and Susan discovered any differences or similarities.
Thank you so much for that question. Not particularly, although if I were to be completely honest, I would say that I think the women opened up more. I think they were more comfortable being vulnerable and sharing, especially when it came to issues like the George Floyd murder, all of the things that happened and things that they were really struggling with. For example, things that we've never dealt with. I think women, in the cases of the 40 that we interviewed, were able to share significantly just more details, like sharing, it's just vulnerability. I don't know how to do this. Where some of the men, I don't think, would say that. So some differences there.
I guess my question is, in light of, when we all lived through this, we kind of lived through it like we'll never live through something like this again. In light of what's happening in our country currently, what do you feel are some lessons that we learned then that could actually be beneficial for us to get through what we're going through now?
Well, it's such a good question, Kelly. I think if you kind of bucket it into like budget, there's a ton going on with our budgets and really just unknown. I mean, every day there's something that we, a notification about some budget cut. And, back with COVID, with the ESSER dollars, that was such a mess. And there's a whole chapter on the complexity of ESSER funding. I think there's some lessons learned about how to engage stakeholders so that they understand, just how complex the funding is, but how school finance works. So there's some lessons learned there. I think there was a sort of a unrealistic expectation that, so the muscle of K12 education is so strong. There was this expectation that during COVID, we would just change it. That the schedules for high schools would just miraculously change, that everything would just be changed, yes, and for the better. But that just didn't happen. But I do think, and there's a whole section on innovation and teaching and learning and schedules. There are things that we can do differently. The fires in California, I was talking to a superintendent, whenever that was, it was not too far ago, and some of the things that they did during COVID, they did during the emergency fires. Thank goodness they had the capacity to lean in on the LMS systems and, project-based learning and, all of those things. But that's not to say that our country need to invest more heavily in closing the digital divide. So, there's things like that we can take away, and they're highlighted in the book. I just think, to Leila's point, the call to action is to not forget what happened and not forget those lessons, because it's so easy, because look how quickly we reverted back, right? I think right now, just to wrap up probably, I think what's on my mind and what concerns me besides literacy is chronic absenteeism. And the fact that kids aren't coming to school, and yet we have different ways to engage them. And we're not really not to our fault, but we're not really utilizing the ways we engaged kids during COVID now. And part of it, again, isn't really our fault. It's the financial and the constraints of Carnegie units, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
As we close out, I want to read a statistic that you all include toward the end of the book. Drawing from the National Center for Education Statistics, we identified the 500 most populous school districts in the country, as well as the superintendent in each district. Since the start of the pandemic in March 2020, 246, 49% of the 500 most populous school districts in the country have undergone or are currently undergoing leadership changes. And I know many of you are nodding right now. And it's July, and we have a lot of folks who are transitioning into the role. I think what I walk away with is really wanting to get the word out about folks understanding and sharing their story. So connecting to yesterday's presentation, both through sharing this book with your community, your leadership teams, but also your own personal story. What is it that you bring every day to the role, and what are your commitments? And I think many of us are leaving modeling self-care so that we have the resilience to be the water that we need to be in what is going to be nothing but an incredibly challenging school year ahead of us. This is only, I don't want to be doomsday, but I think it's only the beginning of the challenges that everybody in this room is going to have to navigate. And so I think there's power to being here at Power Trip in taking care of ourselves, going back and being prepared to endure what is going to likely be another few years of hardship in our community. So Kristi, from the bottom of my heart, you are making an impact, not just for students, but for leaders, for community members. I am so excited to continue the conversation talking about this book. So as you all heard, Martha had to get to another engagement, but we're going to have part 2, and we're going to do a deep dive on innovation and communication, those 2 themes from the book. So I'm going to encourage the audience to subscribe to the K12 Change Equation so that you know when the episodes are released. But stay tuned. We'll be interviewing Martha. I think Marilyn was nodding her head. We'll be having a book club. And to the K12 Change Equation audience that we already have out there, if you are a woman in leadership, I strongly encourage you to learn more about Power Trip and join us next year. I'm walking away a better leader, so thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for being champions of the K12 Change Equation, and may we all go forth and lean on each other in the coming months in the work that we're going to do for kids and teachers.
Thank you. Thank you all.